Whoa, whoa, Updown Girl. I'm not going to sing the rest of it. That would be excessive. But that's the topic of today's video. It's me, Tom Rousel. I'm back again to debunk yet another example of distortion of the history of British people. This time, it's Anglo-Saxon England. There's a new paper out, well, two new papers out this year. One of them deals with two Anglo-Saxon skeletons specifically, and the other deals with one of those same two in more detail. Neither of these skeletons are new. Neither of the analysis is particularly new. And one of them has a slightly newer aspect, which is the one from Dorset. One from Kent, one's from Dorset. The reason for making this paper then is questionable, isn't it? Because back in 2022, a wonderful paper came out, which I did a stream about, or a video about, which was by Gretzinger and colleagues. It was the largest study of Anglo-Saxon DNA ever conducted. It included 460 Northwest European samples, that's skeletons dug up, which is a very big study for any genetics paper, FYI. And those 460, relevant to the actual period of the Anglo-Saxons, were also contrasted with hundreds and hundreds of others. I think a total of 2,000 samples from previous and following eras to get some context. But having 460 mostly new samples means it's a very big and conclusive study. And I found it wonderful because it confirmed what we know about the Anglo-Saxons. But buried in the supplements was something that some of the media got excited about, but it didn't make a really big splash. But some of the woke media tried to make a splash on it, which was that one of the girls discovered therein, and one of the skeletons, was of a girl in the 7th century, Kent, just at the time, roughly, that the kingdom became Christian. The kingdom of Kent was the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom where the king, Erchinbert, had declared that the idols of the old gods had to be destroyed and that people should be Christian. Erchinbert of Kent ruled from 640 to 664. And that is roughly the time that the skeleton from the cemetery, one of the many cemeteries at Eastry, is dated to, that skeleton from that cemetery. And this skeleton was so important because she had some black ancestry. And if you're not aware, in Britain, archaeologists and historians have been going crazy for decades trying to find evidence that there have always been black people here to justify the kind of things the BBC pushes on children saying the blacks have always been here. To date, there has never been a single sample of a black person sequenced, who's pure black, from ancient Britain. Beachy Head was declared black. Beachy Head lady, she was declared black. She was from Sussex. And then when they did her DNA, it showed that she didn't have any black ancestry. Ivory Bangle lady, also a Roman era woman, was declared black based on the shape of her skull, same as Beachy Head lady. But they sequenced her DNA in Sweden and then went very quiet. And they've been sitting on the DNA results for a couple of years at least. And they won't. The Pontus Skoglund lab have not released the results, probably because Ivory Bangle lady is not black either. But as part of this study of Anglo-Saxon DNA, of the hundreds of more than 400 samples that they took, of 2,000 samples from Britain and the surrounding areas at the time, they found one which had about a quarter black ancestry, although they misreported it in that 2022 paper as being more. And the archaeologist who had provided that sample, had been involved in providing that sample to the geneticist for study, Duncan Sayer, got very excited and declared on Twitter that he was going to make sure that there was another paper all about Updown Girl. So I knew this was coming, because that's what this new paper is. Basically, it's just Duncan Sayer pushing for a focus on this girl to show what's going on. And, in his defense, it's a pretty unusual thing to see anywhere in the 7th century Europe, anyone to have black ancestry. As far as I know, it's pretty much unheard of. It would be more likely, it would be less surprising if it was in Spain, but even there it would be surprising. But what made it really, really shocking to me is that the way it was reported initially, and that they're basically still trying to report on it, is that this is a girl who is like mostly Anglo-Saxon and then part black, West African, Sub-Saharan African. They use the proxy to measure the black ancestry as Yoruba, which is a tribal grouping from West Africa, like places like Nigeria. And it's quite a typical genetic profile for West Africans, so it's fine as a proxy for not just Yoruba people, but Igbo or whatever, anyone from West Africa, basically. It'll be a suitable proxy for that DNA. But they're mismodeling it, and a lot of other people have been looking at her DNA and have come to other conclusions. So I'm going to go over some of this in today's video, and I'm going to say what they show in the paper and what they're claiming it shows, how the media are going to try and push this to say, the Anglo-Saxons were black and diverse and blah, 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 which is not what it's showing at all. And also I'm going to say what the new paper by Sayer and colleagues is proposing as an explanation for why there's a girl who's like a quarter black in Anglo-Saxon England, because that's interesting. And also I'm going to say why I think she's there, and it's not the same as what they think. So let's get on with it. First, let's just have a bit of background. The Anglo-Saxon invasion occurred mostly in the 5th century, and that is an introduction of Germanic DNA from Denmark and Germany, which the geneticists term in these papers CNE, meaning Continental North European. This people came and mixed with, gradually, the people of the British Isles, and British DNA, indigenous Iron Age British DNA, is labelled by these geneticists WBI, which means Western British and Irish. So when they say in the papers British and Irish DNA, they don't mean that the people are a mixture of British and Irish. They just mean they're British. But the term for that group is British and Irish because British and Irish were so similar. Irish people are probably not happy to hear that, but it's true. Now, there were no black people in the Germanic world at that time in the 5th century, and there were pretty much hardly any black people in Europe actually. But there were some because of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire started to pull back from the northern territories around 406 AD, and that's what allowed the Anglo-Saxons later, as they pulled out of England in 410, to take over Britain and then mix together to form the English people. But because there were black Africans, sometimes, rarely, among like Ethiopians and stuff in the Roman army, there was people speculating about earlier black presence in the British Isles, but all of that's been pretty much made up and exaggerated for political reasons. There haven't been any solid sources showing that there were any black people. But anyway, even if there were black people stationed, and Roman soldiers stationed during Roman Britain, there was no legacy of DNA from the Romans left in Britain, so it's quite irrelevant. After the Romans left, Britain's genetic state was pretty much the same as it had been before the Romans arrived, which is just what people term these days Celtic, which means like what the geneticists are calling WBI, West British and Irish, whatever. So that was basically the state of, in the year like 500, and then 600 even later, you're talking about the people in England are just going to be a mixture of those two groups. But, and they were pagan because the English coming in did not worship Jesus like the Britons did. The Britons had adopted the religion of the late Roman Empire, Christianity. But the English coming in were from far north beyond the limits of the Roman Empire and have retained an indigenous European religion, worshipping gods like Woden. And many of the British seem to have adopted the religion of the English and given up Christ for Woden, because we can see a transition in burial from Christian to pagan. The western part of England, and this is what the 2022 paper was reinforcing, remained more British and less English, and the eastern part more English and less British. And therefore, the eastern part was more pagan and more genetically Nordic, and the western part was more genetically Celtic and more Christian. But then there was a blending together, gradually, with the modern England now having a gradient with more Germanic ancestry in the east and more Brythonic ancestry in the west. And by the time the English got all the way to the western edge, towards Cornwall, they were a Christian people as well. And the Christianization of England took place mostly during the 7th century and was completed in the 8th century. Now, this is very interesting because Updown Girl is from a Christian burial, and she is dating to the mid 7th century, so 650s or something, and in the Kingdom of Kent, just at the time when Erkenbert has ordered everyone to be Christian and to destroy the idols. So that's really interesting for the context, because if I go back again, just to give before I go into the paper, I want to give some context about why a black person would be in Europe. As the Roman Empire was falling to pieces, Christianity was like the new glue of late antiquity. Christianity was the religion of late Romans as it was falling to pieces. And that includes all the immigrants who made up. Imperial Rome was no longer very Italian. It was all full of Middle Easterners. You had Libyans and Syrians, Egyptians and Jews and all kinds of people mingling together in Italy and other parts of the empire. Very diverse. And Christianity was a good religion for this sort of mixed Mediterranean people to be united under, because they no longer all believed in the foundations of Rome and the Vestal cult and all the things that had built Rome up. Instead, they had this new cult. There's a source provided by Raoul McLaughlin about the Garamantes, which refers to black slaves. Garamantes appear as possible slaves in 2 Latin texts, but these were written in late antiquity around the time the Western Empire was in its final decline. An anonymous poem evokes imagery associated with filth and the underworld to disparage a dark-skinned character. The first verse reads, "This Garamantian filth has just entered our space. This black man born to be a slave is even proud of his pitch black skin." But this short poem finishes with references to mythology and the claim Hades' house should have him as a guard. In that way, they were trying to associate the black skin with the underworld, which is also something in the Germanic world where hell skin is used as an insult for people with darker skin, because the underworld in the pagan religions is associated with darkness. And also dead bodies had darker skin as a process of decomposition. So people in this period in history, seeing other people, like when white people saw people with darker skin, they naturally associated them with corpses and sort of compared them to corpses, which ironically is exactly what dark-skinned people did to white people when they saw them. They often associated them with ghosts because they thought their light skin associated them with the dead. So it was a two-way street in that respect. Continuing from the quote, a 6th century poet named Laxorius criticized a Roman named Muro for pursuing dark-skinned prostitutes who were low status and possible slaves. He writes, "Admit it, Muro, a Pontic girl doesn't do it for you, but a Garamantian does." The poet therefore contrasts the paler-skinned women from the Caucasus and the steppe with those with the darkest complexions, Garamantians. This is possible evidence for large-scale trade in African slaves in late antiquity. There hasn't been a conclusive study to prove that there was a widespread trade of black slaves during that period, like there was in later colonial history of the transatlantic trade, but there is evidence for some black slaves. But it's certainly, if not evidence for that, it's evidence that in late antiquity there was still a concern with the darker skinned people as representing something very, very foreign. And you can go back hundreds of years earlier to Septimius Severus, the Roman emperor, who in Britain encountered an Ethiopian soldier and was shocked by that sight. But I don't want to go too much back to the reign of Septimius Severus because that's much, much earlier. We're talking now about late antiquity and early medieval Europe. So the focus is there. Obviously, actually, in earlier periods of Roman history, there were a lot more use of Africans. But I think towards late antiquity, German slaves were preferred. A lot of Germanic people were enslaved in those times. So you wouldn't expect to see so many African slaves. So to return to these papers, the old one from 2022 mentioned a lot about these 2 samples in question. There's a 10-year-old girl from Eastry in Kent, it said, and in Eastry in Kent, there's loads of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. Most of them are from the pagan period. the last one has all Christian burials, mostly Christian burials, sorry, and that one dates to the 7th century. And in this last cemetery, that's where the grave of Updown Girl is. And she's about 10 years old, a 10-year-old girl, they estimated, based on her skeleton. One newspaper reporting on her previously described her as affluent, and her family as affluent, which is a bit of a stretch. She's buried with a spoon, which is something that you see in Christian burials. It's just some kind of association with Byzantium and Syria, like the Near East and Christianity of Byzantium. For some reason, spoons are a thing for them. So it's not a hugely high status item, but it does reveal definitely like a Christian connection to this girl with a quarter black ancestry. She was buried with 3 relatives that could be traced. One was her aunt, her maternal aunt, so her mother's sister. The other was her mother's mother, and that would be her grandmother. And her grandmother was buried on the side of a barrow. So the barrow is an old high-status pagan grave, and her grandmother was not high status enough to have a barrow, but to be allowed to be buried next to a barrow, indicating some kind of affiliation with the great man within the barrow. And that was quite high status, her grandmother was. But her grave is not that high status. It's a Christian, just a plain Christian grave. She's got a pot, a spoon, and a knife. Everyone had a knife in those days. You can't live without a knife. You cut everything with it. You eat with it. You keep it. The spoon is some kind of Christian symbol. The pot is a bit more interesting because it's a Frankish pottery type, and that shows she had some connections to Francia. Franks in those days, a lot of them could speak a language that was very like English, Old Frankish, an old Germanic language that originates in northern Germany, same as English does. So some of them would have been able to speak with that. And also because many are Christians, some of them spoke with Latin. So there was an easy connection between Kent and France at that time because there were language connections. Kent is the closest part of England to France, and Kent became Christian in that century, which opened up sort of a wider opportunities for cultural exchange with France because of that. And I think this pot shows that quite clearly. And also we can see that although we don't have her mum's DNA, we assume that her mum's the same as her sister, right? Pretty much the same. Her maternal family is pretty much all Nordic. It's like majority Nordic ancestry, with a bit of British and a little bit of Frankish, but mostly like Nordic Germanic. But from the fact that she has a bit more Frankish than she's got more Frankish DNA than any of her relatives in the grave, which means that the absent relative, her absent father, her paternal line is missing, but her father must have more Frankish DNA. In fact, she doesn't have enough Anglo-Saxon DNA for there to be any Anglo-Saxon DNA on her father's side. So all of her Anglo-Saxon DNA comes from her mother's mother. Her father, therefore, must have been a mixture of Black African and Frank, and also Middle East, which is something none of the media reported on previously. No one mentioned it in the 2022 paper, and this new paper, the new one which is going over the same stuff, it mentions Middle Eastern and North African DNA. North African and Middle Eastern DNA are very similar, so, it mentions North Africa 8 times, but it never ever mentions that Updown Girl has North African DNA, which is why I got so confused, because the route for sub-Saharan Black African DNA to get into Europe had to be via North Africa. And you'd expect there to be like Black African DNA mixing with North Africans, and then some North Africans going into Spain, and then maybe some Spain coming up. So you'd expect to see like the presence of like the whole chain of DNA going from France, Spain, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. But in this one, they were claiming it was just Nordic DNA and Black African DNA and nothing else. And I was like, how could that happen? How could that possibly happen? Well, it didn't happen. That's what they just got it wrong, and they're publishing a mistake. There is her father didn't have any Anglo-Saxon DNA, and he did have North African DNA and French DNA. So he's a mixed. He was probably her dad was probably half French and half sort of black Middle Eastern mix. So yeah, I'll go into that a bit more later. The 2022 paper also mentioned another skeleton with a bit of black ancestry from Worth Matravers in sort of west, not almost the West Country, but not quite. It's Dorset is in the western part of Britain, but it's in the far east part of the west part. So it's not that far west, really. But it's away from the centre of the Anglo-Saxon region of the east of England and moving towards the more British areas. But it's sort of halfway. Actually, it's about halfway along the coast from the east to west. So the paper's trying to make out like this is way away from it. It's actually about halfway. But this individual also had a quarter black ancestry, roughly. And it's a male. It said in 2022 paper that present-day Africans similar amounts are measured in present-day Africans from Algeria and Mozabites as well of this Yoruba-like DNA from West Africa. However, those populations also carry high amounts of North African Middle Eastern component, which is minimal in this sample. It is therefore more likely that the sample is the product of recent admixture between a Northern European and a West African source, while small amounts of sub-Saharan African ancestry might be the result of low coverage and or contamination. There's no reason to assume this for this sample. Right. So basically, for this other one from Worth Matravers, this is, again, I'm just talking about the small notes on these two samples that were in this big paper in 2022. They're trying to make the same argument as for Updown Girl, is that they're both a quarter black, roughly, from a direct mixing with Nordic Germanic people or Nordic Celtic mixed people with West Africans. So these two samples are the focus of this new paper now, and they're just expanding on that little stuff that was in 2022. The Worth Matravers sample gets its own paper by Foody and colleagues called Ancient Genomes Reveal Cosmopolitan Ancestry and Maternal Kinship Patterns at Post-Roman Worth Matravers, Dorset. Whereas the other paper, which goes more over the both of them, but with a focus on Updown Girl, is called West African Ancestry in 7th Century England, 2 individuals from Kent and Dorset. And they basically just reinforce the same claims that were made in the supplements of the 2022 paper without adding any decent evidence to reinforce it, and without addressing many of the things that other amateur geneticists and enthusiasts have noted about the sample that once it was made public. So I'll have to do that now instead. And of course, the whole thing is being geared up to sort of show that there was more diversity than we imagined, and that this is challenging our notions of what it is to be English, and that England was always multicultural, blah, 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 blah. Not really actually what's being shown. I should remind you that a study of ethnicity in modern day America shows that people who are less than 25% black don't usually identify as black. So in America, North America at least, people who call themselves black are usually people with more than a quarter black ancestry. Not always. So, and also I can say for example, what would they look like, these people? Would they look black? Because in the paper, they actually are quoting a woke kind of black activist who is saying how it's hard for black people to have black hair and racism, whatever. It says, the black British artist Jade Montserrat notes that a woman's hair is deeply rooted in her identity and heritage, referring to the fashion of straightening hair in line with European aesthetics. And the reason they included this completely irrelevant quote from a person who has absolutely nothing to do with medieval England, a black racial activist person basically, is that there was a comb in the burial, and combs are also a very normal grave good of the time. There's nothing unusual about this comb. It's not an afro comb like black people have special afro combs. And they got this big black art in the scientific paper which says her hair, like history, is flattened, ironed and erased. There is nothing in the grave to indicate that she flattened or ironed her hair, or that she would ever have to. There's a comb, a normal comb that any white person would use for their hair in England at the time. to give you an idea of what might Updown Girl have looked like, she's probably, I mean, this is a picture I'm showing on screen now of Brittany Venti, who is an influencer and her DNA test shows she's about 30% African, which is around the same region that we're talking for Updown Girl. Now, Brittany Venti just has normal white people hair. She has coloured eyes. She has some phenotypical traits that you can tell that she has sub-Saharan black ancestry. You wouldn't stare at her as like a black person in medieval England might be stared at for like being looking so different. It's not that different. She just has some slight traits. So the likelihood is that this girl was not especially racially different phenotypically from the people around her. She might have had she probably did have some traits that would be recognizably African, perhaps the nose or the teeth, or that she might have had curly hair as well. We don't know. They haven't done an analysis of her phenotype in the paper. But there's no reason to think that she was like black. She wasn't that black. She was mostly white. So, and none of her black relatives are in the cemetery. They're all absent. The only people in the cemetery to whom she's related are on her mother's side, who are all Nordic Germanic. None of her her recent French ancestors are there either. So what's happening then? Well, I have my theories. I'll get into them later. So the new paper about the two black samples says the following. The discovery of recent sub-Saharan ancestry for two individuals who died and were buried as ostensibly typical members of their communities around the middle of the 7th century at separate sites in southern England adds a new dimension to data on long-distance movement and demographic interaction involving Britain. It also contributes to our understanding of extensive economic and political relationships through and around the Mediterranean in the 6th and 7th centuries. North Africa has been a key region for the Roman Empire, particularly for the grain and oil it could supply. Roman imperial rule had itself succeeded earlier states in Egypt and Carthage, and the Roman army recruited African barbarian troops from the western provinces of Mauritania and Numidia, who served and could eventually settle across the empire. Mauritania being where the Berbers come from. A tantalizing contemporary story of a ship laden with grain sailing from Alexandria to Britain in the early 7th century and returning with a load of tin, turned miraculously into silver, implies that this was an exceptional voyage rather than a regular trade route. That comes from Leontius of Neapolis, The Life of John the Almsgiver. Yet there is abundant evidence of pathways by which individuals of recent West African ancestry could have travelled to mid-7th century southern Britain. It is significant that it is human DNA and therefore the movement of people that now expands our awareness of the range of long-distance interaction further south to sub-Saharan Africa. There was substantial trans-Saharan slave trading to the Caliphate by the 9th and 10th centuries, but there is no reason to believe that black Africans were falling victim to large-scale enslavement and trafficking as early as AD 600, although lamentably such behaviour is possible in any historical circumstances. So they're trying to say, we don't think this is a slave. They don't want it to be a slave. I've noticed a lot of people on Twitter, right-wing people saying they think, it's probably a slave. Actually, I don't think it's a slave. I know that's what everyone is kind of leaning towards. It's possible, but I'll go into more after a second. In the two cases discussed here, the eventual outcome of opportunistic movement along important trade routes is the more plausible scenario. The paper basically tries to argue that there was an important trade of gold from sub-Saharan Africa and that this movement of DNA probably was carried along a merchant route of gold traders. That's not unreasonable in the sense that if there was gold in Europe, but there isn't any much African gold in England. The gold in England is mostly Anglo-Saxon style artifacts with some Byzantine coins, and it's thought that a lot of the Anglo-Saxon gold was melted down coins from Byzantium or whatever. But some of it was just from Britain because Britain had gold. There were gold mines in the Bronze Age and stuff, and so there were gold artifacts around. Old Celtic artifacts from Britain could be melted down as well when they were found. So I'm not aware of any evidence of specifically West African gold in England. And this grave has none of these graves have any gold in, so they're not associated with gold, these graves. They're not associated with gold merchants in any way. One of them, the Updown Girl, to focus on her, is associated with the Franks and with Christianity. both of these graves are associated with Christianity. So my tendency is to associate the African DNA in these graves, in these skeletons, with Christianity as well, which was then a new religion for the English, not for the Britons further west, but the English had only one Christian kingdom at the time, Kent, where she was buried. The rest of England was still pretty much all pagan. And there are no blacks in the pagan part of England. None. Or there are no blacks in any part of England. There's just two people with a quarter black ancestry, which is not the same thing as being black. But anyway, it's interesting. The conclusion begins with a quote from the Anglo-Saxon translation of the Bible Exodus story, which they translated as "easily found then was the African maiden on the ocean shore adorned with gold." Now, that passage in question isn't in the original Bible, so it has raised eyebrows about why the Anglo-Saxons added it in. Basically, the Jews fleeing from the Egyptians or whatever were joined by, in the Anglo-Saxon version, people referred to as Africans, meaning someone other than Egyptians, presumably. And this means some kind of other slaves of the Egyptians beside the Jews. The Jews in the Anglo-Saxon version of Exodus are written as if they were Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxon pagans are encouraged to think of Jews as being like them. I did a video all about the way that propaganda was used to make Jews in the Bible seem more like Saxons, to try and convince people to convert to this religion. And also they're integrating this maiden who was adorned with gold. And the authors of this paper are trying to somehow connect the Anglo-Saxon knowledge of Africans covered in gold with the presence of African DNA of a woman, and then make this link with the gold trade. It's a big reach, a far reach. There's no gold here. There's no reason to associate with gold. They have to reach for straws because we don't really know why they're there. But I think part of the reason they're reaching so much is because they've misinterpreted the genetic evidence. So let's have a deeper look at that. So in their own analysis of the DNA, which I'm showing here in these two graphs, there's a PCA on the right, and you can see the two red squares, and EAS003, that's Updown Girl, and I11570 is the guy from Worth Matravers. And they are both plotting just like North Africans. So if you didn't know about the admixture analysis, you'd just say these are Moroccans because they plot like Moroccans. But then they're not. We're not. On the left, you can see the two samples labelled. The arrows are pointing a little bit too far down. They're not the correct two, but the two. So you can see both of them are mostly blue, which is Northern European colour. The Northern European colour is blue on these bar charts, and each of these is one sample. And they're not 100% accurate. For example, they think the Algerians got some blue or whatever. I guess it's just mixing up some other. It's a pretty poor model. But anyway, they're both showing green in there. You look at all the Northern European samples at the bottom. Only two have any green, and that's these two samples. And that green, if you see at the very top, is the same as Yoruba. It was 100% green. So Yoruba is the West African DNA. So yes, they have West African DNA. But if you look closely at Updown Girl, she also has orange and yellow. So the yellow section is North Africa and Middle Eastern DNA. As you can see on the PCA, the colors correspond. And the orange is East African DNA. And East Africans are a mixture of Middle Eastern and Sub-Saharan African anyway. So you're getting mixed, that kind of thing. So yes, she does have it. And they never this is their analysis. They can see that she has North African DNA, Middle Eastern DNA, but they don't mention that in either the 2022 paper or this paper. And you can see that the other sample from Dorset, that Worth Matravers sample, has a purple, which is actually an Asia, or kind of Asian or East Asian or something like that, maybe South Asian. But that's a mistake. But it probably shows that, we know that means he's not got Asian DNA, but that means the sample's wrong. They've got that, not the sample, that the model is wrong. There is something that is neither European nor African, and the model is trying to fix it by adding in an East Asian component. You can see that they've got that in the Turkish, which is probably correct because they do have some East Asian DNA, but they've also got it in like Palestinians and Yemeni, where they probably don't have, strictly speaking, East Asian DNA, but this model's not great. But it's probably the case that the Worth Matravers man has mixed Byzantine heritage from the West Asia. That's what this East Asian DNA is, actually some West Asian component that's been conflated. And also black African ancestry from the aforementioned black slaves who were being traded in Byzantium. So I think you can explain that like a black slave in Byzantium he mixed with native not Turkish, like pre-Turkish Greeks of Anatolia, to get that West Asian DNA. I'm guessing it's going to, if we got that sample and analyze it properly, it would show that he had ancestry from the from the East Mediterranean, which is West Asia, mixed with black ancestry, and then that Christian infrastructure allowed a person with black ancestry from Anatolia to move into Western Europe and up into Britain. And that grave in Worth Matravers he's sharing a grave, this quarter black guy. I think he's less than a quarter black because I think he's got a lot of West Med ancestry as well as being mixed up with it. And the other guy is just a British guy who's buried with an anchor under his head because he's a sailor. And he's sharing a grave with a sailor, which is weird. Why is he sharing a grave? Well, they say in the other paper, which is just about the Worth Matravers man, that it's possible that he was a slave or a servant or something like that. So I think what you've got here is a Christian Briton basically he's a sailor and he travels and trades with regions associated with Byzantine goods. And he's picked up this servant or whatever he is of some point, and he's like, this guy also has British ancestry too, by the way, this mixed guy. So, or maybe his dad was a servant who was picked up somewhere, or maybe he was a preacher or something, and he's come to Britain mixed with a British woman, and then the child is this, or grandson is the product, who is now a servant in a sailing vessel that's come ashore near Dorset. That would explain him. I think something else is going on. The girl from Kent is obviously, her ancestry is mixed with Middle Eastern, and they're trying not to talk about it. Same for him as well. But look, I just wanted to show their crummy model first to show that it's in their model and not being made up. Here are I'm going to show you now some other people models done not by the authors of the paper, but by genetic enthusiasts who are in many cases more right than the people behind the papers, but not always. But they can have some excellent insights. So when these models, using software like Vahaduo and other kinds of software that allow you to try and figure out the ancestry of an individual skeleton by taking a bunch of other skeletons that you think could be from ancestral populations and then putting them into the model, and then it will say if it can build a similar genetic profile of the subject in question from the samples you've provided, then it will be a good fit. And if it can't, then it'll be a bad fit. And the better the fit, the lower the distance. So you can see the best fit of the four in this presentation would be 49.2% early medieval Saxon, which is basically what we know that this person has. She has that. She's half English. 18.2% Congo-related proto-historic, like an ancient Congo, black in other words. So 18% black. And then 17% Moroccan and 15% Libyan. So North African, the actual best fit for this, using in this particular model, gives the girl more North African ancestry than black ancestry. So it may be that the authors of the paper have mismodeled her to the extent that they've inflated her black ancestry so that it doesn't show any North African ancestry, which is there in even in their own analysis, as I've showed. Here you can see 4 attempts at modelling her. None of them are very good. All of them use one black sample and one Anglo-Saxon sample. And if they were right to say that she was just part black and part Anglo-Saxon, you would get a good fit. But that like 6%, 9%, 8%, I say like a good fit should be like 1% or less, or something like, or at least 2%. But these are not working. And yeah, Yoruba is 6. If they use Yoruba or Congo, they get down to 6%. So it works better than if they use an East African source like Ethiopian, but it's still not good enough really to explain, because there's something missing. You can't model this girl with just Anglo-Saxon and black. It doesn't work. There's something else. Now, here's another 4 models, and these ones are quite good. They're getting much smaller distance. And one of the best ones here, it uses Anglo-Saxon and then Berber, Algerian Berber, which is what I think this is correct. And then Ethiopia, Congo is getting mixed up there. I don't think she's got any Ethiopian ancestry. I think what you're going to see, it would be something like Yoruba and Berber, Algeria or something would be a better fit. But Tunisian Berber, actually I say that, but then believe that you've got Berber and Yoruba and Anglo-Saxon, and that's only a 2% fit, 2.67% fit. So yeah, it works better when you add in an East African source for some reason. But also it works quite well here with the Canary Islands Guanche, which is a very unusual population with high native Northwest African ancestry, which is neither Arab nor black nor European. It's a Paleo-African ancestry from Northwestern Africa that survived on the Canary Islands among a people called the Guanche. This probably doesn't mean that this girl has Guanche ancestors, but it just means that there's a component in her ancestry that is related to the Canary Islanders. In other words, Berber, some kind of Berber population, because the Berbers have similar ancestry origins to the Guanche people, who are extinct, by the way. So, and then they've used Congo, Canary Islander, and Anglo-Saxon to get a quite good fit. I think you can agree, if you look at the paper's actual modelling shows her North African ancestry, and then all these independent analyses show that the best fits are not just black plus Nordic Saxon, but you have to add in a Northern African component, something relating to Berbers, in order to get the right fit. Then we can start to actually say who this person is. And I will now tell you what I think that is. In the 7th century, when she was alive, there was a known Berber in Anglo-Saxon England, a famous one called Hadrian or Adrian the African, aka Adrian of Canterbury. He was a famous Christian scholar and the abbot of St. Peter's and St. Paul's Church in Canterbury, in Eastern England. And he was originally a Berber, but he ended up in Naples, in Italy. Now, you may all think of North Africa and the Berbers as Muslims, and that's right, they've been Muslims since the Arab conquest of North Africa, which took place in the 7th century, in the mid-7th century, at the time Updown Girl was alive. Now, before the Muslims, Islam was a brand new, fresh religion at the time, and it was spreading across North Africa in the 7th century very quickly by the sword. It was spread by the sword. But before that, because of the influence of the Vandals and the Romans in North Africa, the region was mostly Christian. Well, at least there were Christians there. There were some, people practicing odd local pagan religions too, but it was a lot of Christians. So Adrian was probably a Christian when he was born in North Africa. And I think there were a lot of Berber Christians in the first part of the 7th century. And by the end of the 7th century, I think the Berber Christians had all converted to Islam or fled. Another paper on Spanish DNA shows that the North African DNA enters Spain not in the 8th century, just in the 8th century when the Muslims invade from North Africa into Spain and bring Islam there, but in the preceding century. And that's because Christian North Africans were running away from the Muslims and into Spain. And so the influx of North African DNA was coming then. And many Berbers then and now have black ancestry because Berbers, you trade black slaves. Blacks were used as slaves for, right back into history. And also they were right on the border of there were black kingdoms to their south and they were mixing with them sometimes. So I think all Berbers today have some black ancestry. But back then, not all of them did, but some of them did. I don't know if Adrian of Canterbury had black ancestry. Probably didn't, because most depictions of him show him looking very white. And a lot of Berbers would have looked very white, actually, because they have like relations to Near Eastern, like Arab populations, but they're actually a different population. And they also have ancestry from Neolithic Europeans. So some of them end up looking quite European, even having ginger hair and things like that. Now, therefore, Adrian the African could have been black or he could have been white, but I'll go into this. Michael Wood, the famous British historian, pop historian from television and stuff like that, you've probably seen some of his documentaries. In Michael Wood's fact sheet about Hadrian the African, he says, Hadrian was born in North Africa in the 620s and died in Canterbury on January the 9th, 709 or 710. He was of African race, vir natione Afir. So Bede and Hadrian were alive till Bede was in his 30s. Bede is one of our main sources on Hadrian the African, and they were alive at the same time. The use of this term by the likes of Virgil, Martial, and Statius, it is often specifically used by Latin poets to refer to a native of Libya. That means not a black person, because the Libyans in that day were not black. Maybe then he was a Berber, Amazigh. Probably as a fluent Greek speaker, he was from the Greek-speaking part of North Africa, i.e. Cyrenaica. I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. But where exactly, we don't know. In the lecture notes taken down by his students in Canterbury, Hadrian mentions the exotic birds in a North African palace from his personal experience in Libya. So he spent time in a region that was then called Libya. By the way, the word Libya now refers to a country called Libya. In those days, Libya was a term more broadly used for parts of North Africa that aren't part of what we now call Libya. Could this be the impressive colonnaded palace excavated at Apollonia, the main centre of Byzantine Christianity in the region up until 645, when the Arabs probably took it down? Is even his name a clue? Hadrianopolis is nearby, close to Benghazi. For a useful book, he recommended, it doesn't matter about that, on Hadrian's ethnicity, Professor David Gantz suggests to me that a face in an illuminated initial in the famous Salaberger Psalter, now in Berlin, but written in 8th century Northumbria, is intended to depict a black person. Leslie Webster, former head of the early medieval department at the British Museum, considers it a unique image. Now, I find that very amusing. As an aside, this is the capital I think he's talking about. And they're trying to claim that this is a black person. I don't know if they're saying it actually represents Hadrian himself, but this is in Northumbria, in northern Anglo-Saxon England, that it was made in the 700s. So 100 years or so after Updown Girl was buried. The same century Hadrian died in, but he died at the beginning of the century. But that is not a black man. You can see he's got coloured hair. And yes, the face is dark, but that I thought everyone would know, especially an expert like Michael Wood, that is the discoloration of the metals used in the pigments, the paints. You can see around the eyelids, they're still white. And also around the hairline, the skin is still white. But it's in part where the metal has been tainted over time, it's made the colour change to a darker hue. Now, obviously, if it was meant to depict a black person, they wouldn't have given it red hair and red lips like that, and white eyelids and white hair, white skin underneath the hair. It's obvious. I find it actually absurd that any one expert would ever suggest that was intended to depict a sub-Saharan African person. But that just shows you the general climate in academia, in the museums, in the media. When talking about Anglo-Saxon England, they're very ready, very, very, very ready to accept something might be black, even though It's very obvious they're not. Now, the only reason I mentioned Hadrian is because how did this guy, this African, who probably wasn't black, I don't think he was black, but he was a Berber, how did this Berber end up in Anglo-Saxon England? Well, we know how, because he was sent there by the church. Hadrian was sent to Britain because he was familiar with the roads to Gaul, having previously been sent there. And he was specifically sent to Kent. And he was arrived under the rule of King Egbert, who was the son of Erkenbert, the first Christian king of Kent, who was probably ruling at the time of Updown Girls. So these graphs show roughly how old those samples are. So the Worth Matravers one is somewhere between 600 and 800. It's quite a big sample, but I think we're talking about overall probably late 600s, so late 7th century. Whereas the one at the bottom, the Updown grave, is more likely to be is somewhere between 600 and 650. That's grave 34. Now, grave 34 is not Updown Girl's grave. That dating is not for her grave. It's a grave right next to it, which has a pair of scissors and the blade and such things in it. Grave 47 is Updown Girl. Grave 34 is a relative, I think. So we can say with some confidence, Updown Girl lived and died at around the age of 10 or 11 in the mid 600s, the mid 7th century. It's a time when Adrian of Canterbury was alive. Adrian arrived in England around 668 or 669. It's a time when Erkenbert had made the kingdom Christian around 640. So, I mean, she might not have lived through all of these things, but Erkenbert and Adrian, the Berber, this is all going on in Kent, where she lived at the time of her life, roughly, and around the time. Her grandmother was a pagan. We know that. We can see that she's next to a barrow, as I said earlier. But her aunt, I think, is a Christian. So her family became Christian. Now, Berbers were Christian as well in that time. So this Berber, shown from the DNA, she's got Berber ancestry. The West African ancestry that she has only comes via Berbers. And the Berber ancestry only enters England through Frankish contacts. And they make that clear in the paper and in some of the articles in the news that are going to be talking about it. This region of Kent had a special Frankish connection during that time, which increased after Erkenbert accepted Christianity. The Franks were the first viciously Catholic Germanic people. I mean, there have been earlier Goths who converted to Arian Christianity, but those didn't really have much of an impact on the rest of the Germanic world. The Franks are the first Germanic people to try and make to try and make the Anglo-Saxons and later the Saxons on the continent. Charlemagne oppresses them and tries to make other Germanic people follow the late Roman religion of Christianity. So, this is what I think happened. A Berber with a lot of black ancestry was involved. Now we can see that it's on Fig B, on this model. We can see that the maternal aunt of Updown Girl has about double the Germanic CNE ancestry as her, which means that her dad didn't have any. She didn't get it from her dad. She got it from her mum. However, the CWE, which is Continental West European, which means Frankish in this context, could also mean some Spanish, is enriched in Updown Girl relative to her aunt, indicating her father was approximately half Frankish. I'm not clear on the exact percentages, but I think her father would have been a mixture of Black Berber, which is a mixture itself of Berber and Sub-Saharan African Yoruba-like ancestry from West Africa, and Frankish. And then he was a Christian Frank, her father, who's not in the grave. So somehow this Christian Frank would have come into England, probably on a mission to help convert these people, because these people are only just being converted in his time. So her mother was probably a Christian. Her mother's not there either, but her aunt was Christian, and her grandmother isn't. So it seems to me that, it's her parents' generation who are converting, probably under the rule of Erchenbert, and there are probably Franks involved in encouraging Kentish people, the kingdom of Kantwara, to convert. And because Berbers are a Christian population in Francia, they are, and in Italy, such as Adrian of Canterbury, who's historically attested, they were sent to Kent, just like Adrian was at the same period, to help make the Saxons Christian, to try and bring them into this Mediterranean world of worshipping a holy Jew. So they were successful, at least in Kent at that time. So if her father was part Frankish, which I think seems possible, although the independent models aren't showing that, but the papers models show an excess of Frankish ancestry in her, which would make me think that it was coming from the African line, is bringing the Frankish DNA in. Then I would say that her paternal grandfather, the African, was a Berber who left North Africa and married a Frankish woman or a Spanish woman or something like that. And then his son is the half Frankish, half North Berber, black Berber person who then went into England to help convert. The Anglo-Saxons had a child upon a Saxon woman, but was not buried with her family. An absent black father in the 7th century. Wow. That's what I call a tradition. But he's Christian, so he's based. So that explains her. But explaining Dorset is a bit difficult because they're trying to portray this in another way. Because they're trying to say, okay, well, that was the core Anglo-Saxon region, which is sort of not true exactly because they, by their own admission, Kent had a strong Frankish influence, whereas other parts of Anglo-Saxon England didn't, and so were more connected to the Germanic world rather than to Franks. The Franks were Germanic at the time, but they were the least Germanic of the Germanics in a way because they were very Christian and they were very plugged into the post-Roman world. But Dorset's a bit different because it's only marginally Anglo-Saxon at the time and very much more in still part of the post-Roman Britain culture of Western Britain. I'll quote the other paper that came out, the Foody and colleagues paper about the Worth Matravers individual, which was found near Bournemouth in a cemetery of, well, they've got 20 individuals from the graves. Only one has any black ancestry. Should say that again, that let's look at this, hundreds of samples from Anglo-Saxon and hundreds, all of them are white. So when we're saying they're diverse, what we're really saying is they're all white except two who are quarter black or something like that, which is not really a big deal. It's not very diverse, is it? But anyway, and this is the way they all report on it. They'll try and make out like the whole place was like Notting Hill Carnival. It says, Worth Matravers sits west of the distribution of early Anglo-Saxon furnished burials found in southern and eastern England, and did not become part of Anglo-Saxon Wessex until the mid-7th century, just before this sample was buried. Here we present the combined archaeological and genetic analysis of early medieval kinship, blah, 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 blah. The combination of maternal and paternal lineage and genome-wide ancestry patterns is most likely the product of admixture between a European woman and a West African man at around grandparent level. As this admixture was relatively recent, it is unlikely to represent a relic from the Roman period, but instead suggests an ongoing cosmopolitanism in the post-Roman period that was not limited to the influx of northern continental ancestry. So that's true, actually. It's saying that like the cosmopolitanism of post-Roman Britain was not limited to the influx of Anglo-Saxons. There was also this African signal, which is obvious. It's an obviously true statement based on that sample having it. But I just don't believe that sample's right of it just being a European woman. I don't think his grandpa was a pure African and who met a pure Celtic woman. I just don't think that happened. I think that the obvious reason I don't think that, I haven't seen an independent analysis of this sample like I have for Updown Girl, but because I don't think it's been made public yet. But the way that their own analysis includes this Asiatic component, which I think they're trying to dismiss as, a mistake. That mistake is happening because the model doesn't fit. Like there's something missing. There's another component which isn't accounted for in the model. So they need a better model. And my assumption would be that it's North African again, or, as I said earlier, Byzantine, and that it's either black slaves going via, or black people. It's not having to be slaves. It could be black merchants, but either black slaves or black merchants are going via the Berbers through Spain and up to France and then Britain, or alternatively, another route and more likely to be slave related, black Africans taken to Anatolia, to Byzantium, and there they integrate with Christendom and then spread out to other parts of Christendom. Byzantium, Istanbul now, is the capital of Christendom in that period of Anglo-Saxon England. So any Christian in Kent would see Constantinople as his capital, spiritual capital of the world, as far as a Christian would be concerned. And there were black slaves there, for sure. So that's a possible thing as well. I don't know which. But they talk about, there is evidence. I said I don't know about any evidence of black African gold in England, although there might be. But there is some elephant ivory in England that at the time that comes from African elephants. But, that doesn't mean that there was direct contact with Africans, and these people are themselves not evidence of direct contact with Africans, because these mixed people, it's not even that one of their parents was a pure black person. Neither of them have a pure black parent. It's grandparents. So it's 2 generations ago, and those mixing events probably didn't occur in Britain. I think they both occurred further south, and then what you've got is like a half African person coming to Britain and then producing quarter African children in Britain. We have 2 quarter African children as a result. Despite his genetic differences, it says, KD010 evidently received similar treatment in death to other individuals at the site and consumed a comparable diet during his lifetime. He was, notably though, the individual was buried in a double burial alongside an older adult male with local genetic ancestry whose head was resting on a Purbeck limestone anchor. This type of headrest, although recognised from Romano-British and early medieval periods, is extremely rare, particularly in securely dated contexts. As there was no close biological kin relationship between the two, their double burial might suggest a possible work, such as apprentice and master, or social kin relation. The presence of the anchor further suggests an association with the sea, its size implying use on either a small vessel or as one of multiple anchors on a larger boat. Both seafaring connections and local coastal fishing are demonstrated in this area at that time. So yeah, I really think like the association with this native Britain, pure native Britain, and the anchor is showing there's a connection to something abroad. Dorset, by the way, is a coastal region. This is this burial is near the coast. There's an anchor in the grave. Something's going on here that is not coming from Britain. So yes, are either of them representative of Anglo-Saxon England? No. Both of them are peripheral to the Anglo-Saxon world. One, Kent, which is the first Frankified, Christianized English kingdom. The other, Dorset, which is not fully Anglo-Saxon. It's only just become Anglo-Saxon. It's very still influenced by the Celtic, Christian, Romano-British world. And it's got this specific maritime connection evidenced by the anchor, showing that there's a foreign element coming into this region. So both of them are not representative of the region. Neither of them are black. I don't think either of them would have black skin. They would probably be somewhat African looking because of their sub-Saharan African black ancestry. But, as I said, with Brittany Venti, or indeed with the children of, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, their children are quite white looking. They're about a quarter black as well, I expect. So people who are have that little black ancestry don't look like the woman I've put in my clickbaity thumbnail, which I've just done for a joke. Like, I don't think they would be identified as black if they lived in North America. If they lived in London today, they probably would identify as black because they'd get more grants and money for it. But the whole paper is completely unnecessary because everything they're talking about is really already covered. And Duncan Sayer, I think he's pushed for this paper because he knew that it's a woke topic that everyone, like a lot of people want to hear it. Like, and there's a big market for telling British people that blacks have always been here and that we're not really native and blah, blah, blah. I just want to let you know for sure, like, what is the connection between modern British people and these 2 quarter black people in these graves? Nothing. That girl died at 10 years old, and she's the youngest in her family line on that cemetery. She had no children because she was 10 years old. There are no younger burials and no burials of her line afterwards. That was the end of her family. They're the end of her line. Her pagan grandmother, buried right round the corner, next to a barrow, could never have anticipated that within 2 generations, her religion would have been lost. Her children would have mixed with foreigners, and Kent would have been unrecognisable already in its cultural direction within just 2 generations. The rest of England at that time was more like this girl's grandmother. They were pagan, worshipped Woden like I do, and they were not mixed with Africans. And modern English people do not have African ancestry. There's no like medieval African ancestry in the English gene pool. It's just not there. The same can be said for the guy in Dorset. There's no, like, the pre-Saxon Britons of West Country don't have African admixture. This is just a one-off. It's absolutely remarkable that these 2 samples have been found. Very interesting, actually. And it's been quite interesting to go over. Think about how on earth this black ancestry got so far north. Because we don't even find it that like in this levels, even in Spain at the time, where there's contact with the much more contact with the Berbers. Because the average Berber didn't have black ancestry. Only like they do now, but back then the average one didn't. Only some of them did. And the Moors in the following century in Spain, the majority of the Moors didn't have black ancestry. Some of them did. After they became Muslim, there was maybe a slight increase in the amount of African slavery. So they used more black slaves, so maybe more of them mixed with their black slaves. Gradually, the Berbers got more black admixture. But yeah, the Berbers, most of them were not black at all. I don't think Adrian was black, as I said, but Updown Girl, there's a lot of parallels between Updown Girl and Adrian of Canterbury. So yeah, Britain, was Anglo-Saxon Britain black? No. That's all for today. Keep surviving the Jive. I'll see you next time. Are you interested in worshipping the gods of ancient England and Scandinavia, but you're not sure how to do it? Starting Heathenry is a ritual-focused online course which will furnish you with the knowledge and confidence to practice the heathen religion, alone or with others. The course teaches you how to construct heathen prayers for yourself, not according to the established rites of any modern group, but according to what historical sources show. Starting Heathenry assumes you're interested in Germanic paganism, know about the gods and myths, and want to begin practicing this religion, but require guidance on how to do so. It is based on a micro-learning structure, which is proven to improve knowledge retention by up to 80% in students compared to other learning methods. You get more than 5 hours of learning material, bit by bit, as you please. A modern method of learning about an ancient religion. Your path to knowing the gods through ritual starts here.